Daniel could not sleep that night. He lay in his quarters on the diplomatic station, staring at the ceiling and thinking about human teeth in an alien emperor's skull. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fear on High Curator Telvis's face. Something was very wrong with the official history of the galaxy. He climbed out of bed and sat down at his computer terminal, searching every database he could access for information about the Kelith Dominion. The results were almost empty. Few lines mentioned them as an ancient civilization that had existed before the Volrathi rose to power. But there were no details about their culture, their technology, or how they had gone extinct. 12,000 years of galactic history, and the Kelith had been reduced to a footnote. That erasure was not accidental. Daniel reached for his communication device and called the one person he trusted to help him dig deeper. Kevin Park answered on the third ring, his face appearing on screen with the confused expression of someone who had been woken from deep sleep. "Daniel, it is 3 in the morning, Kevin said, rubbing his eyes. "I need your help accessing restricted archive databases." Daniel replied. Kevin was the best technical specialist on the diplomatic station, capable of bypassing security systems that should have been unbreakable. And more importantly, he was Daniel's friend. "What did you find?" Kevin asked. Suddenly alert, Daniel told him everything about the skull, the human teeth, and the curator's reaction. And by the time he finished, Kevin was already pulling on his jacket. "Meet me in the secondary communications room in 20 minutes, Kevin said. "That terminal has the best connection to the archives network." They worked through the night, Kevin slicing through Volrathi security protocols while Daniel searched for any mention of the Kelith Dominion. The deeper they went, the more they found, and what they found changed everything Daniel thought he knew about human history. The Kelith Dominion had not been just another ancient empire. They had been the original rulers of the galaxy. A civilization so advanced that their technology still surpassed anything the current galactic powers could achieve for over 50,000 years. They had maintained peace across countless star systems, not through military conquest but through cooperation and shared knowledge. They had uplifted younger species, giving them technology and guidance to help them reach the stars. And then, approximately 12,000 years ago, they had been systematically exterminated. "Daniel, look at this," Kevin whispered, pulling up a heavily encrypted file. It was a genetic analysis, buried so deep in the archive's restricted sections that it had probably not been accessed in centuries. The results made Daniel's heart stop. The Kelith had not been similar to humans. They had been genetically identical to modern humans in every measurable way. The same DNA structure, the same protein expressions, the same biological markers that defined humanity as a species. "This is impossible," Daniel said, but the evidence was right in front of him. "No," a voice said from behind them. "It is simply forbidden." They spun around to find a young Volrathi standing in the doorway, her gray features illuminated by the glow of their screens. Daniel recognized her as Archivist Saleith, one of the junior staff members who had assisted during their tour. "I should report you both for accessing classified information," Saleith said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "But I have been researching the same mystery for 30 years, and I have never found anyone else who asked the right questions." She sat down beside them and began pulling up files that even Kevin's skills had not been able to reach. The Kelith were not conquered by a superior force, Saleith explained. They were betrayed by the species they had uplifted, the species they had trusted and helped and treated as younger siblings. She showed them records of a coordinated attack, dozens of species turning against their benefactors. In a single devastating assault, the Volrathi had led the coalition. But they had not acted alone. Why? Daniel asked, struggling to understand how anyone could turn against those who had helped them. "Because the Kelith believed in peace," Saleith answered. "They refused to build weapons of war, and they shared their technology freely with anyone who asked." So when their children decided they wanted to rule rather than cooperate, the Caliph had no way to defend themselves. The genocide had lasted less than a century. Every Caliph world had been destroyed, every ship hunted down, every survivor executed. Coalition had erased them so completely that within a few generations the Caliph became nothing more than a myth. A cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting too freely. But how is that possible? Kevin asked. Humans evolved on Earth, and we have fossil records going back millions of years. Salaith pulled up one final file, a fragmentary report from the final days of the Caliph Dominion. Earth was a remote colony on the edge of explored space. She said, when the Caliph realized they could not win the war, they erased the colony's coordinates from every database and destroyed every ship that knew its location. She looked at Daniel with something like wonder in her alien eyes. They sacrificed themselves to hide you, she said. And somehow, over 12,000 years, you forgot everything you once were. Daniel stared at the screen, trying to process what he was hearing. Humanity was not a young species that had stumbled into a galaxy of ancient civilizations. They were the survivors of the oldest civilization of all, hidden away on a forgotten world while their ancestors were slaughtered. The Velrathi knew that was why they treated humans with such careful caution, why they watched every human ship with barely concealed anxiety, why they had gone to such lengths to keep the truth buried. They were not afraid of what humanity was. They were afraid of what humanity might become if they ever remembered what they had lost. What do we do with this information? Kevin asked quietly. Daniel thought about Ambassador Monroe and her careful diplomacy, about Admiral Cole and his fleet of human warships, about the billions of people on Earth who had no idea that their species had once ruled the stars. We find out what else they are hiding. Daniel answered, because if the Velrathi have kept this secret for 12,000 years, they must have a very good reason to be afraid of what happens when we learn the truth. Salaith nodded slowly, her decision already made. Then I will help you, she said, because some secrets are too terrible to keep, and some truths deserve to be remembered. Daniel Harris had never seen so many dead civilizations in one place. The Grand Archive of the Velrathi Dominion stretched before him like a cathedral built to honor extinction, and every hall contained the remnants of species that no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. Walked beside Ambassador Lisa Monroe, keeping his expression neutral as their Velrathi guides led them deeper into the orbital museum. But inside his mind was racing with questions he knew better than to ask out loud. The Velrathi had invited them here for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with cultural exchange. High Curator Telvos glided ahead of them, his tall gray form moving with the practiced grace of someone who had spent centuries among the dead, and his voice echoed through the vast chambers as he described each display with obvious pride. This armor belonged to the last warrior king of the Selvath Dominion, Telvos explained, gesturing toward a case containing battle-scarred metal plates. They believed themselves unconquerable until they met our ancestors 12,000 years ago. Daniel noticed how the curator emphasized certain words, how every exhibit seemed designed to remind the human visitors of one simple truth. The Velrathi had outlasted everyone. Ambassador Monroe smiled politely and asked appropriate questions about artistic techniques and historical preservation, playing her role perfectly. But Daniel caught the tension in her shoulders. She understood the message too. They passed through halls containing weapons that had failed to save their wielders, crowns that had adorned heads now turned to dust, and technologies that had not been enough to prevent annihilation. The Velrathi had conquered or outlived them all, and now they displayed the evidence like trophies. Humanity is fortunate to have entered the galactic community during an era of peace, Telvo said, and his tone suggested that this peace existed only because the Velrathi allowed it to exist. Daniel said nothing, but he filed the comment away in his memory. 300 years ago, human ships had first encountered alien life. And since then, humanity had learned to navigate the complex politics of a galaxy filled with species far older and more advanced than themselves. The Busties. Velrethi treated humans with careful politeness. Never openly hostile, but never truly welcoming either until today. Daniel had assumed this was simply how they treated all younger species. Now he was beginning to wonder if there was something more behind their cautious behavior. They entered a new section of the archive, and the atmosphere changed immediately. The lighting grew dimmer, the displays more elaborate, and the air itself seemed heavier with significance. The Hall of Fallen Sovereigns, Telvos announced with obvious reverence. Here we preserve the remains of rulers whose empires once challenged the stars themselves. Crystalline cases lined both walls, each containing the preserved remains of beings who had commanded armies and worlds. Daniel saw skulls of every shape imaginable, some with multiple eye sockets, others with cranial ridges that suggested telepathic abilities, and a few that looked more mechanical than biological. But one case drew his attention immediately, and he found himself walking toward it before he even realized he had moved. The skull inside was different from the others. It sat on a pedestal of black stone, crowned with a circlet of metal and precious gems that still gleamed after thousands of years. And the bone itself had been treated with some preservation technique that made it shine like polished ivory. The placard beside it read, Emperor Kalos the Eternal, last sovereign of the Kelith Dominion, extinction date 11,847 cycles ago. Daniel stared at the skull, and something cold began to spread through his chest. He was a historian by training, and he had spent 20 years studying human evolution before joining the diplomatic corps. So he knew exactly what he was looking at. The cranial structure was unmistakable. The jaw formation was identical, and the teeth were not similar to human teeth. They were human teeth. Curator Telvos, Daniel said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. Why does this skull have human teeth? The silence that followed was so complete that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. Ambassador Monroe turned to look at him with concern in her eyes, clearly wondering why he would ask such a provocative question during a diplomatic visit. But Daniel could not look away from the skull. He had examined thousands of dental records during his academic career, and he knew the human dental formula as well as he knew his own name. 32 teeth arranged in exactly that pattern, with exactly those proportions, could only belong to one species. A fascinating coincidence of parallel evolution, Telvos said, but his voice had changed. Many species develop similar physical characteristics when adapting to similar environmental pressures. That is not parallel evolution, Daniel replied. Those are human teeth in every measurable way, and the skull structure matches human anatomy precisely. He pointed to the jaw, the mandible proportions, the dental arch, the placement of the molars. All of it is identical to what I would find in any human being on Earth. Telvos remained silent for several seconds, and Daniel saw something flash across the curator's alien features. It was fear. Ambassador Monroe stepped forward, placing herself between Daniel and the Vorathi guide with practiced diplomatic smoothness. I apologize for my colleague's enthusiasm, she said. He sometimes forgets that academic curiosity should yield to social courtesy. There is no need for apology, Telvos replied, but his eyes remained fixed on Daniel. The human attach is simply mistaken, and I am sure further examination would reveal significant differences that are not visible to casual observation. Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to demand access to the skull for proper scientific analysis, but Ambassador Monroe's hand on his arm warned him to stop. He nodded and stepped back, letting the tour continue. But as they moved through the rest of the Hall of Fallen Sovereigns, Daniel kept glancing back at the skull of Emperor Kalos the Eternal. The Caliph Dominion had ruled the galaxy 50,000 years before the Vorathi rose to power. And according to the placard, they had gone extinct nearly 12,000 years ago. Someone had killed them, someone had erased them from the galaxy so completely that Daniel had never even heard their name before today, and they had been human. Every instinct in Daniel's body told him that the Vorathi were hiding something enormous, something that explained why they treated humanity with such careful caution. Despite their overwhelming technological superiority, they were not being diplomatic, they were afraid. Ambassador Monroe led him out of the archive without speaking, and only when they were safely aboard the human shuttle did she turn to face him. "What did you see in there?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked out the viewport at the massive Vorathi station, thinking about a crowned skull with human teeth and eyes that had been closed for 12,000 years. "I think I found out why they are scared of us," he answered. "And I think we need to find out what really happened to the Caliph Dominion." The secure meeting room aboard the human diplomatic vessel was silent as Daniel finished his presentation. Ambassador Elisa Monroe sat with her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable. Admiral Nathan Cole leaned back in his chair, his military mind clearly processing the implications of everything he had just heard. Kevin stood beside Daniel, ready to answer any technical questions about the data they had recovered. "You are telling me," Admiral Cole said slowly, "that humanity is not a young species at all, but the survivors of an ancient civilization that once ruled the entire galaxy." "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, "and the Vorathi, along with dozens of other current galactic powers, participated in a genocide that wiped out our ancestors 12,000 years ago. The evidence is conclusive." Daniel confirmed. Admiral Cole turned to Ambassador Monroe. "What are your thoughts, Ambassador?" Monroe was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "If this information becomes public, it will destroy 3 centuries of diplomatic relations," she said. "Every treaty we have signed, every alliance we have built, all of it will be called into question." "With respect, Ambassador," Daniel interrupted, "those treaties were built on lies. And the species we consider our allies are the descendants of those who murdered our people." "I understand your anger," Monroe replied, "but we must consider the practical consequences of revealing this truth. Because we are not the Caliph, and we do not have their power." "She has a point," Admiral Cole said. "Our fleet is capable, but we cannot fight the entire galaxy." Before Daniel could respond, a communication alert chimed through the room. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the aged face of Grand Prelate Vorash, supreme leader of the Vorathi Dominion. His ancient eyes looked directly at Daniel. "I believe we need to speak," Vorash said. Ambassador Monroe stood immediately, her diplomatic training overriding her shock. "Grand Prelate, this is an unexpected honor. Please dispense with formalities." "Ambassador," Vorash replied, his voice heavy with centuries of authority, "I know what your attach has discovered, and I know that Archivist Elaith has been assisting him." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "You have been monitoring us," Kevin said. "Of course," Vorash answered without shame. "We have been monitoring humanity since your first ships entered our space 300 years ago. And we have been waiting for this day since we first confirmed what you truly are." The prelate's image shifted as he adjusted his position. "I am offering you the opportunity to hear the complete truth before you make any decisions about how to proceed," he said. "Will you accept?" Admiral Cole looked at Daniel, then at Ambassador Monroe. "We will hear what you have to say." The Admiral replied. Vorash nodded slowly and began to speak. Everything Solaith had told them was true. But the full story was even worse than Daniel had imagined. Caliph had been the first spacefaring civilization in the galaxy, and for 50,000 years, they had guided younger species toward the stars with patience and compassion. They had believed that the universe was meant to be shared, That knowledge should flow freely between all thinking beings. And that war was simply a failure of understanding that could always be resolved through communication. They were naive, Varish said. And there was something like regret in his voice. They gave us everything and asked for nothing in return. And we repaid their kindness with betrayal. The coalition had formed in secret. Younger species who had grown tired of Keleth guidance and wanted to rule their own destinies. They had used Keleth technology to build weapons the Keleth had never imagined. And when the attack came, the gentle rulers of the galaxy had been completely unprepared. We told ourselves it was necessary, Varish continued. We told ourselves that the Keleth were holding us back, that we deserved to control our own futures. But the truth is that we simply wanted what they had, and we were willing to kill to take it. Daniel listened with growing horror as the prelate described the systematic destruction of every Keleth world. The hunting of refugee ships, the execution of survivors, and when it was over, Varish said, we divided their territory among ourselves and agreed to never speak of what we had done. Why are you telling us this? Ambassador Monroe asked, because you asked a question that no one has asked in 12,000 years, Varish replied, looking directly at Daniel. And because I am tired of carrying this guilt. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. I am offering humanity a choice, he said. Accept recognition of your heritage, receive territory and reparations, and in exchange agree to keep the full truth from becoming public. You want us to stay silent about genocide in exchange for payment. Daniel said flatly, I want to prevent a war that would destroy everything. Varish replied, because if the truth becomes known, every species in the galaxy will have to choose sides. And many will choose to finish what was started 12,000 years ago rather than face human vengeance. Admiral Cole leaned forward. You are saying that revealing this truth could start a galactic war. I am saying it will definitely start a galactic war, Varish confirmed. And humanity will be at the center of it. Daniel stood, unable to contain himself any longer. What happened to the Keleth who survived? He demanded. We know there were some who were captured rather than killed, so where are they? Varish was silent. Answer the question, Admiral Cole said, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. They are alive, Varish finally admitted. Kept in stasis on a secure facility. Studied periodically to understand their technology and biology. The room erupted and outraged. Ambassador Monroe demanded. Coordinates. Admiral Cole began issuing orders to his fleet. Kevin was already calculating intercept trajectories, but Daniel simply stared at the screen. Seeing the truth behind Varash's offer, the Varathi were not trying to make peace. They were trying to prevent humanity from finding their ancestors. Because they knew that once humans and Keleth were reunited, everything would change. We reject your offer, Daniel said, cutting through the chaos. We will find them ourselves. And then we will decide what comes next. Varish closed his eyes briefly. Then I have done all I can, he said. And whatever happens now is beyond my power to prevent. The screen went dark. Admiral Cole turned to his officers. Find that facility, he ordered, and prepare the fleet for possible combat operations. Ambassador Monroe looked at Daniel with a mixture of admiration and concern. You just declared war on the most powerful species in the galaxy. No, Daniel replied. I declared that humanity will not be bought, and that we will not abandon our family to save ourselves. He headed for the door. Now let us go bring them home. The prison station hung in the darkness between stars. Far from any shipping lanes or inhabited systems, it had been built to be forgotten. A place where secrets could be kept forever. And for 12,000 years, it had served that purpose perfectly. But now human ships surrounded it, and the secrets were about to be set free. Commander Ryan Torres led the assault team through the station's corridors, his rifle raised as they cleared each section. The Valorathi guards had surrendered almost immediately. Seemingly unsurprised that this day had finally come, Daniel followed behind the soldiers, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Somewhere in this station were survivors of the Callous Dominion, beings who had been kept frozen for millennia while the galaxy forgot they ever existed. Ambassador Monroe had worked through the night to discover the station's location, calling in favors and making threats that would have ended her career if anyone learned about them. Admiral Cole had dispatched 3 warships to secure the facility, with strict orders to avoid casualties if possible. They did not want to start the war any sooner than necessary. "We have found the stasis chamber," Torres reported through the communication system. "It is unlike anything I have ever seen." Daniel hurried forward until he reached the commander's position, then stopped in stunned silence. The chamber stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction, filled with crystalline pods arranged in precise rows. Inside each pod was a figure that looked unmistakably human, sleeping peacefully as they had slept for thousands of years. "There are at least 500 of them," Kevin said, checking his scanner, all showing stable life signs. Daniel approached the nearest pod and placed his hand against its surface. The being inside was a woman with dark hair and features that could have belonged to anyone on Earth. She did not look like an ancient alien from a forgotten civilization. She looked like someone he might pass on the street back home. "How do we wake them?" Torres asked. "I am not sure we should," one of the soldiers replied. "We have no idea how they will react after being imprisoned for 12,000 years. They are not the enemy," Daniel said firmly. "They are family." He began searching for the pod's control mechanism, and after a few minutes, Kevin found the activation sequence in the station's database. The crystalline surface began to glow, and slowly the woman inside opened her eyes. She blinked several times, confused and disoriented. Then her gaze focused on Daniel's face. Her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and finally wonder. "You found us," she whispered in a language that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow made perfect sense. "We did not know you existed until a few days ago," Daniel replied. Surprised that he could understand her, the woman smiled weakly. "That was the plan," she said. "We erased every trace of the colony's location and destroyed ourselves rather than let the knowledge fall into enemy hands." She reached out and touched Daniel's cheek with trembling fingers. "But we always hoped that someday our children would return." More pods began to activate as Kevin worked through the system, and soon the chamber was filled with awakening. Kelith embraced the human soldiers as long-lost relatives, weeping with joy at the sight of descendants they had never expected to see. An elderly man approached Daniel, his bearing suggesting authority even after millennia of frozen sleep. "I am Vardis," he said. "I was a member of the Council of Elders when our civilization fell." "I am Daniel Harris," Daniel replied, cultural attached to the human diplomatic mission. Vardis studied him carefully. "You speak our language," he observed. "I do not know how," Daniel admitted. "It simply makes sense to me, because it is your language," Vardis explained. "The colonists we sent to Earth were given linguistic programming that would pass through genetic memory, so that if you ever returned, you would still understand us." He looked around at the human soldiers. "But I must ask, why have you come with weapons?" he asked. "The Kelith never carried weapons. The galaxy is not the place you remember," Daniel said. "And we learned on Earth that sometimes peace must be defended with force." Vardis was silent for a moment, processing this information. "Then you have learned something we never could," he finally said. "And perhaps that is why you survived when we did not." Commander Torres approached with urgency in his voice. "Sir, we have incoming Varathi ships," he reported. "At least 20 warships. And they are not responding to our communications." The peaceful reunion was over. Admiral Cole's voice came through the communication system. "All ground teams, Prepare for immediate evacuation. We cannot hold this position against those numbers. We need more time, Daniel replied. There are still hundreds of pods that have not been activated. You have 15 minutes before we have to withdraw. Kevin worked frantically at the controls, accelerating the awakening process while Torres organized the evacuation. The Caliph, who had already awakened, helped their still sleeping kin, supporting them as they stumbled toward the human shuttles. But 15 minutes was not enough when the Vorathi fleet arrived. There were still over 100 pods that had not been opened. We have to go now, Torres insisted. We cannot leave them. Daniel argued. Vardis placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You must, he said. The ones you have already saved are enough to restore our knowledge and our culture. And those who remain will wait for you to return for them. I will not abandon anyone. Daniel said. You are not abandoning them, Vardis replied gently. You are ensuring that their sacrifice has meaning by surviving to come back another day. The first Vorathi weapons fire struck the station's outer hull, and the structure shuddered violently. Torres grabbed Daniel's arm. Now, sir. They ran the shuttles launched under heavy fire, weaving between Vorathi ships as Admiral Cole's fleet provided covering fire. Daniel watched through the viewport as the prison station grew smaller, thinking about the Caliph still inside, still sleeping, still waiting for rescue that might never come beside him. Vardis watched as well. You fight, the old man said quietly. We had to learn. Daniel replied. The Caliph never built weapons, Vardis continued. We believed that if we showed the galaxy kindness, kindness would be returned. He watched a human warship destroy a Vorathi cruiser with precise, devastating fire. We were wrong, he admitted. But you learned the lesson we could not teach. He looked at Daniel with pride and sadness mixed in his ancient eyes. You are still our children, he said. But you have become something we never were. Survivors who can protect themselves and those they love. The human fleet jumped to hyperspace, leaving the Vorathi behind. They had rescued nearly 400 Caliph, the survivors of a civilization that had been dead for 12,000 years, but the war had begun. And there was no turning back now. Daniel sat in the shuttle's cargo bay, surrounded by Caliph, who was still trying to understand that they had been asleep for millennia. One young woman sat beside him, staring at her hands as if she did not recognize them. What is Earth like? She asked quietly. Daniel thought about his home, about blue oceans and green forests and cities full of people who had no idea where they truly came from. It is beautiful, he said. And soon you will see it for yourself, she smiled. The first smile she had managed since waking. Our ancestors chose well, she said, to send us somewhere beautiful. The shuttle continued toward human space, carrying the oldest and youngest of humanity toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in 12,000 years, the Caliph were not alone, and humanity finally knew who they really were. The rescued Caliph wept when they first saw Earth from orbit. They pressed against the viewport of the human vessel. These ancient beings who had been asleep for 12,000 years, and they cried at the sight of blue oceans and white clouds and the green continents where their descendants had built civilizations without ever knowing their true origins. Vardis stood beside Daniel, tears running down his weathered face. We sent them to a world at the edge of nothing, he said. A small colony on a planet we barely remembered. And they turned it into this. Daniel watched the old man's reaction with deep emotion. We did not know what we came from, Daniel replied. But we built something anyway. That is what makes it beautiful. Vardis said the Caliph were taken to a secure facility where they could recover from their long sleep and begin to adjust to a galaxy that had changed completely, but they brought something with them that changed everything. The location of the Caliph archives, a hidden repository containing the complete knowledge of their civilization within days. Human scientists were studying technologies that made current galactic capabilities look primitive clean energy that could power entire planets' communication. Systems that worked instantaneously across any distance, medical science that could extend human lives for centuries. The galaxy had killed the Caliph to steal their knowledge. But they had only taken scraps. The real treasure had been waiting for humanity to come home and claim it. Ambassador Monroe spent weeks preparing for the moment that would define the future of both humanity and the galaxy. When she finally stood before the Galactic Council, the Caliph elders stood beside her. The chamber fell silent as representatives of 300 species stared at beings they had believed extinct for 12,000 years. "You know who these people are," Monroe began, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. "You know what was done to them. And many of your ancestors participated in their destruction." She let that statement hang in the air. "We have evidence of every crime committed during the genocide," she continued. "Every world that was destroyed, every ship that was hunted, every child that was killed to prevent them from growing up to seek justice." Murmurs rippled through the council. Many species looked away in shame. Their history suddenly revealed as far darker than they had pretended. The Velrathi delegation sat in complete silence. Grand Prelate Vorash, looking older than Daniel had ever seen him. "Humanity could use this evidence to demand punishment," Monroe said. "We could call for trials and reparations and revenge. And much of the galaxy would support us because they fear what we have become." She paused, looking around the chamber. "But we are not going to do that." The murmurs turned to confusion. Daniel stepped forward to speak. "Having been chosen by both humans and Caliph to deliver this message, the Caliph were destroyed because they believed in kindness without strength," he said. "They trusted the galaxy, and the galaxy betrayed them." He looked at Vardis, who nodded encouragingly. "Humanity learned a different lesson on Earth," Daniel continued. "We learned that kindness must be paired with the ability to defend it. That trust must be earned rather than given freely. And that peace is only possible when those who threaten it know they will face consequences." He turned to face the Velrathi delegation directly. "We will not repeat the Caliph's mistake," he said. "But we will also not become the monsters who destroyed them." He held up a small device. "This contains records of the genocide," he said. "Every species that participated, every leader who gave orders, every decision that led to the deaths of billions." The chamber was utterly silent. "We are not going to release this information," Daniel said, "not because we want to hide the truth, but because we believe that the future matters more than the past." He lowered the device. "The Caliph taught the galaxy how to reach the stars," he said. "And the galaxy repaid them with extinction, but that was 12,000 years ago. And the beings who made those decisions are long dead." He looked around at the assembled species. "We will not punish children for the crimes of their ancestors," he said. "But we will remember what happened, and we will ensure that it never happens again." Ambassador Monroe stepped forward again. "Humanity is offering the galaxy a chance to start over," she said. "We will share Caliph technology freely, just as they once did. But we will also maintain the strength to protect ourselves and those we love." She looked at the council with determination in her eyes. "The choice is yours," she said. "You can accept our offer of partnership and help build a better future. Or you can cling to fear and face the consequences of that choice." Grand Prelate Vorash rose slowly from his seat. The entire chamber held its breath. "The Velrathi accept humanity's offer," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "And we acknowledge our role in the crimes of the past." He looked at Vardis. "We cannot undo what was done," he said. "But perhaps we can help prevent it from ever happening again." One by one, other species rose to offer their acceptance within hours. The galaxy had transformed 3 days later. Daniel stood in the Grand Archive beside a Caliph elder named Seralish, was the daughter of Emperor Kalos the Eternal, the last sovereign whose skull had started. Daniel's journey toward the true Cirilla had been barely an adult when the genocide began, and she had spent 12,000 years frozen in a prison cell while her father's remains were displayed as a trophy. Now she stood before the crystalline case that held his skull, and her hands trembled as she reached toward it. "He was a good man," she said quietly. "He believed that if we showed the galaxy enough love, it would love us back." She touched the case gently. "He was wrong about that," she continued. "But he was not wrong about everything." Daniel stood beside her in respectful silence. "He would have liked you," Cirilla said, turning to face Daniel. "He always said that the colonies were the true future of our people, that they would learn things we could never teach them." She smiled sadly. "Think he was right." High Curator Telvos approached hesitantly, carrying a small case. "The Council has ordered the return of all Keleth remains," he said. "We thought perhaps you would want to be the one to take him home." He opened the case to reveal the crown skull. Cleaned and carefully preserved, Cirilla took her father's remains with shaking hands. "Thank you," she said. And there was no anger in her voice, only grief. She turned to Daniel. "Will you help me?" she asked. "I would like to give him proper rights, the way our people did before we forgot how." "Of course," Daniel replied. They walked through the archive together, the Keleth princess and the human historian, carrying the remains of an emperor who had died believing his children were safe outside. The galaxy was changing. Humans and Keleth were working together to share ancient technologies with species who had once been enemies. Treaties were being rewritten, old grudges were being set aside, and somewhere, in a prison facility that would soon be emptied, more Keleth were being awakened to discover that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Cirilla spoke the old words over her father's skull, ancient prayers that Daniel understood in his bones, even though he had never heard them before. When she finished, she looked up at the stars visible through the archive's transparent ceiling. "We are not the Keleth anymore," she said. "And you are not the colonists we sent to Earth." She looked at Daniel with hope in her eyes. "We are something new," she said. "Something that combines the best of what we were with the strength you learned on your own." Daniel nodded. "We remember who we were," he said. "And now we know who we can become." Cirilla smiled. "My father would have liked that answer too." They stood together in the archive, surrounded by the remains of dead empires and fallen civilizations. But for the first time in 12,000 years, humanity was not defined by loss. They were defined by what came next, and that was something no one in the galaxy had ever seen before.